right, I'm gonna give you this, and then I'm gonna go try to put my eye back. And then I'll be. Good luck. With both eyeball. Don't take a sip yet, don't drink.
All right. Well, good morning. I'm Tiffany with O'Kelly and Sorhan. Let me make sure I know how to use this thing. Okay. So they asked me to speak on 1031 exchanges, and I want to give you kind of a heads up on what the goal is here. The goal is for you as agents to be able to spot when maybe you're working with someone who would be a potential good candidate for a 1031 exchange. And like you've probably heard other attorneys say this and the broker boys say this, but it's always great to be the source of the source, not the source of the information. So I'm not trying to make anybody a 1031 expert. I am not a 1031 expert. 99 times out of 100, when people ask me like really specific questions on 1031s, I say, let's call Rachel, who is the expert. But you want to be able to spot it, because sometimes like if you got, you know, if you're working with a listing and you can spot that this is a good potential for a 1031, then not only are you going to get that listing sale, but you may be able to help them find the replacement property. So, you know, if you're their go-to person and give them this great idea, it might benefit you in spotting another sale. So what is a 1031 exchange? It refers to section 1031 of the IRS code. No gain or loss is recognized when property held for productive use in a trade or business for investment is exchanged solely for replacement property of like kind, which is to be held for productive use in a trade or business for investment. We're going to go into what like kind is and replacement properties and all that in just a little bit, but it's essentially taking the tax that would be due when you sell an investment property or an income producing property and deferring it till later. And I'm going to give you all kinds of examples so you'll be able to see it in color. In just a minute. Okay, so reasons to exchange. Deferral of capital gains. That's the big thing. So nobody wants to pay capital gains taxes. Deferral of depreciation recapture. This is where my knowledge is really janky. Depreciation recapture in taxes is outside of my realm. But I know that it's one of the benefits to the 1031, especially with property that has not been held very long. Improve cash flow, greater purchasing power on the buying side if they're going to reinvest. Build and preserve wealth, estate planning, relocation to different geographic areas, and diversity in your real estate assets. So one thing that I see a lot in my practice is the relocation thing. So like I work with a couple of 1031 intermediaries out of New York, and they'll have one person sell a property in New York that's worth $2 million, and then they get to replace it with multiple properties in Georgia because they're moving down here. And so they just want their, you know, they want to stay in the real estate game, but they don't want property held in New York when they're moving down to Georgia, so you can relocate without having all those taxes. So this is just a basic example. So you have a property that's worth $1 million. The basis is $100,000. So say you bought this property 10 years ago and you paid $100,000 for it. You're selling it for $1 million today. The gain would be $900,000. If you did a full 1031 exchange, we're going to go into full and partial. There would be no tax due at the time of the year that you did the sale. It's not due at the time of this one. If you just take the proceeds from that, then they're estimating 22.5% capital gains, which is just an estimate. But capital gains tax, just so you guys know, people are like totally terrified of it. It's actually a lot less than income tax. So it's more in that 20 to 25% realm, depending on your income, but still nothing anybody wants to pay. So that's just a really basic example. We'll get into a little more detail in a minute. So what is a qualified intermediary? A disinterested third party that has not acted as an agent of the taxpayer within the last 2 years and cannot be related to the taxpayer. We're going to talk about their role. So you're going to do a 1031 exchange. The first thing you have to do is identify who your QI is. They document the exchange for the taxpayer. They coordinate with settlement agents on each of the closings, the buy and the sell. They act as a principal on the sale of the relinquished property and purchaser on the replacement property through assignments of the contracts. They receive the net proceeds from the relinquished property, the one that's sold. They fund the replacement property purchase, and they're required to facilitate a 1031 exchange unless you're just swapping properties for the exact same value. My closing right before this was 1031, and It was a little property, it's Keller Williams, but not this office, on Hamilton Mill Road. And the owner had owned it for 20 years. Didn't know anything on it. And so he wanted to reinvest in another rental, but they were moving. So the proceeds from that sale were like 300,000. He had paid 60,000 for this like bazillion years ago, updated it, all that. And I sent the money directly to the QI. So we had to have all the information before, you know, they signed everything at the table. I send the wire directly to them, and now he's gonna have the 180 days to identify new property and sell it. I mean, purchase it and all that without having that gain. It's a super easy process, but this QI is, you have to have that set up prior to closing. If you take the funds from closing, if we send you a wire, the opportunity to do a 1031 exchange is off the table. So you can never touch the funds if you're doing a 1031 exchange. I have had one or two over the 19 years that they decided like at the table to do it. So I just had to hold the proceeds until they got somebody and, you know, that's not the best way to do it, but it's possible. As long as they never touch the funds, it's possible to do a 1031.
Tiffany,
Mhm.
can that 180 days be extended for any reason?
I'm not gonna say no, but there's probably very specific exempt, you know what I mean? Like natural disasters or stuff like that.
Oh.
I can get a better answer for you, but there's not any that are like frequently known, you know what I mean? Because it's a half a year, you know, there's not any that I know of, but I can find out.
You have to be under contract within the 180 days, or you just have to like identify?
You have to, so we're gonna get into that in just a second, but you have to identify within 40 days, you have to close within 180. But I'll give you some more numbers on that in just a second. Back on the QI, so who you wanna use for this is actually really important. You wanna choose somebody that's got good financial strength, they are bonded, professional liability insurance, experience, and segregated accounts for their 1031 exchanges. These people are potentially holding hundreds of thousands of dollars for you for 6 months. So you want to make sure that it's somebody that is well known. We have a few great referrals at the firm. If you need anybody, I can always get you some. And with them, yeah, with all referrals, I always give at least 2. So that if they hate it, then you had a choice. So I'm gonna go into the structuring a little bit of the partial and the fully deferred exchange. So this is, the property was sold for $1 million. The payoff was 200,000, net proceeds to the QI are 800,000. The replacement property they identified was a little bit higher price, so 1.1 million. They took out a $300,000 loan, and then the proceeds from the exchange were 800,000. So that's a fully deferred exchange. They took all of the proceeds, reinvested it exactly, and so they're kind of a wash. There's no tax there. A partially deferred exchange, sales price is $1 million. They pay off a loan that was 200,000. They've got the proceeds of 800. This one, the new purchase price is still 1.1, but they want to take out a higher loan. So they take out a $400,000 loan. The proceeds, they can only apply 700,000 because that's all that's left to apply. So that extra additional 100,000 that's going to be coming back to the seller is what's called the taxable boot. So instead of paying taxes on 800,000, they're only paying taxes on 100,000. So a lot of people do that because they want to pull some money out. They need it for some reason. You know what I mean? They don't want to defer the whole thing. Another example is when this one's when they're purchasing something that's less expensive. So you're going from $1 million property to a $900,000 property, a $200,000 loan to a $100,000 loan. The taxable boot is still 100,000 because they didn't purchase at the same expense, if that makes sense. And y'all don't need to know any of the like details of that, but the exchange process. So this is what we were talking about. You want the contract for the sale of the relinquished property to have this stip in there, and it's in your GAR special steps. There's a 1031 special stipulation, and the companies that the QIs will always give it to you also. But essentially, you are reserving the right for the seller to assign the proceeds to a qualified intermediary. You engage the QI. They prepare all the exchange documents, the agreements, and closing instructions to the settlement agent. There are fees for them. You know, we collect them at the time of the closing. I think today's was, like 150 and 480 were the two fees for the QI for the seller that was doing it today. Closing on the sale of the relinquished property. So that's what we did today. The exchange documents are executed prior to or on the day of closing. In my case today, there were some that were executed prior to closing. They had two that had to sign at the table. The taxpayer signs a settlement statement. The property is deeded from the taxpayer to the buyer, and the exchange proceeds are wired to the qualified intermediary. And that's when the exchange timeline begins. So the relinquished property closing date is day 0 of 180. So now he's got 180 days to complete this process. The replacement property must be identified within the first 45 days, and the 180-day exchange deadline can be shortened by tax filing dates. So say you're closing a 1031 exchange in November and you want to file your taxes prior to April 15th or whatever, that the time period can be shorter if you're trying to do an exchange for this year. So it's not a guaranteed 180. All right, so the identification of replacement property. 3-property rule, it can be up to 3 properties without regard to value. 200% rule is any number of properties provided that the total aggregate doesn't exceed 200% of the relinquished property. So like this came into play with my New York couple because they had millions and they needed to buy lots of property down here in Georgia in order to use that up. And then the 95% exception, any number of properties at any value, but must acquire 95% of the total aggregate value of identified properties. So these are the properties that you're identifying. So say in the example that we've been using, that the $1 million example, you've got $800,000 worth of funds to work with there. You can identify up to 3 properties without regard to value. So you can identify $1 million property that you really want and say, I want that to be the one, and then 2 others that may be an aggregate of the $1 million. You can identify more than what you intend to buy, just in case one sale doesn't go through or you're iffy on one of them. You can identify up to 200% with as many properties as you want, and then the 95% exception, but you end up having to acquire 95% of those. And where that gives the taxpayer some leeway there is sometimes you don't know within 45 days, if this is the avenue you want to go down. Do you want raw land? Do you want another income producing property, anything like that? So you can identify multiple properties as long as they meet the requirements here under one of those 3 steps. The identification notice must be in writing. The property must be unambiguously described, and the property acquired by the taxpayer must be substantially the same as what was identified. And they include that in there in case you identify raw land that is, 10 acres, you get a new survey, the legal description ends up being a little bit different because the old one was, 50 years old. As long as it's substantially the same, you're okay, but you can't totally change it. The contract for the purchase of the identified property can enter a contract by the purchaser replacement property at any time. The contract should include a cooperation clause. Your 1031 qualified intermediary will give you that. And then the QI prepares the exchange documents and closing instructions on the purchase side as well. At the close of the replacement property, the 1031 documents are executed at or before closing, hopefully before. The taxpayer signs the settlement statement approving the amount from the 1031 company, and the QI wires the 1031 funds to the table. It's normally very easy. We do this on the structure. On a fully deferred exchange, the replacement property must be equal or greater in value. And so that's where, you remember that example where they went from the $1 million property to the 900,000, there's still a taxable boot there because they went down in value. You must reinvest all the net proceeds in a fully deferred exchange and must replace any debt. So if there was a $200,000 mortgage that you're paying off on the sold property, you've got to at least have a $200,000 loan on the new one for a fully deferred exchange to get the full benefit. A taxable boot can occur when you fall short of the investment requirements or the application of the 1031 funds toward unacceptable closing costs, which we'll get into that in just a second. Other exchange structures, I'm just gonna touch on because I've never closed either one of these. So a reverse exchange allows you to purchase your replacement property before you ever even sell the one that you're relinquishing. I have never done that. It is possible, but never done it. And then improvement exchanges, so it allows for capital improvements on your replacement property. So they have I have seen that where they have a dedicated amount of the funds that's gonna go into improvements. So say that property that you're reinvesting is 900,000, but you've got 100,000 that's dedicated specifically for improvements, then you wouldn't fall short of the requirement of it being equal value. Does that make sense? Because you're gonna improve it up to that equal value.
Tiffany, can I ask a question on that? It says tax deferred. What does that mean? Like, so when would the tax requirement roll around for that if you did that on that improvement exchange?
When you sell the replacement property.
You gotta pay taxes on the amount that you allocated out for the improvements.
And that's a good question and a good thing to remember with 1031 exchanges. This is just a tax deferral. So eventually down the line, when they decide to stop reinvesting in real estate, there is going to be a tax. What this saves you from is having it on every single time you transact. So you just pay it one time at the end versus every single time you're reinvesting. Important considerations, like-kind property. The definition of that is very loose. It's basically any income producing property, vacant land. You know what, let me get to the slide right here. So these are examples of types of property: commercial buildings, residential rental, raw land, working farm, vacation or second home. But there's serious use restrictions for that. So if it is a second home that's not going to be rented out, that's not going to be income producing, it's not qualified for a 1031 exchange. If it's one where you may be using it sometimes, but then you're going to be renting out your condo in Florida, 70–80% of the time. I don't know exactly what the use restrictions are, but I know that they're very tight with that. Go back. Title vesting has to be exactly the same. So if I own my land over in Beaufort as Tiffany T. McWhorter and Jason P. McWhorter, then when we repurchase, it has to be the names have to be exact. If it's under, it has to be exact vesting. Can't be related parties, so I couldn't purchase from my family members, stuff like that. And then there are some holding requirements depending on what type of property you're selling and purchasing. They're different for different types, so I didn't even go into that, but the holding requirement for a duplex is different from vacant land and how long they've had to own it. Restricted access to exchange funds, closing costs, y'all don't really worry about that. All right, definition of like-kind. So I kind of just went into that, but all real estate is considered to like-kind to each other and exchangeable under the IRS section, provided it's held for long-term investment, income-producing purposes, or for productive use in trade or business. And so I gave those examples. We already talked about the title vesting. Related parties. I said that you can't be related at all, but you must hold the property for a minimum of 2 years before reselling, I guess, with related parties. And then taxpayer must hold replacement property for a minimum of 2 years before selling. So you can't just keep doing them within shorter time frame than 2 years. All right, holding periods. Properties included in 1031 exchange must meet their holding requirements. And like I just said, it's different holding periods for different types of property. There's no clearly defined amount of time. It's based on the taxpayer's intent, length of time the property is held for qualified purpose is indicator of taxpayer's intent. I don't know who decides this. If the qualified intermediary looks at it and says, I don't know, you haven't held it long enough. I don't know, because there's not like a chart you can go to that says specifically what has been held for what time. And then we already talked about the restricted access to the funds. The taxpayer can never have access or control over the exchange funds. Can only go directly to the QI and then directly to the new purchase. If no property is identified within the first 45 days, the QI can close out the 1031 and the identification period done, it expires. So worst case scenario, you end up in the same boat that you would have been if you never tried to do a 1031. So you're not in any kind of worst position.
Ask another question.
Uh-huh.
What if you have money that has been deferred, it's in that QI and and identified something else, and the two people that were on the original property and one of them dies?
That is a good question, because you can't best title exactly the same.
Right.
I do not know the answer to it, but I can find out.
Okay,
I'll ask
okay.
Rachel.
Good question.
Yeah.
Yeah, only because I've just recently, we've had a couple situations where somebody has passed away in the middle of a transaction. I know that's so sad,
Yeah.
but I know it happens. And so now that this is coming up more, it's becoming more popular again with the market shifting. Just
I
want to,
think if you're in the middle of one, then
like if the QI already has the funds and you're trying to identify what the new properties are, you
Yeah.
can't access the funds.
I will find out. That's all.
Okay, yeah,
I
just
don't know.
because that's been, kind of came up recently.
I have a lot of dead people.
I know, it's
Like,
it's crazy.
So you guys don't really need to worry too much about into this. But there's some expenses that can be included in what the QI funds cover, some can't. So you'll see like repairs, closing expenses, reoccurring and non-reoccurring expenses are treated differently, but just leave that up to the qualified intermediary. You don't need to get into that. The role of the realtor, this is what I was trying to get to. So spotting one. And that was the whole point of getting you guys familiar with you. Like I said at the beginning, you want to be able to spot, you know, a good investor that may qualify for a 1031. So you're listing a property that's a rental, that's vacant, commercial real estate, or raw land. Any of those should bring up a little, I wonder if this would be a good candidate for a 1031 exchange. And the reason why is because you want to sell that property that they're selling, and then you want to help them find the replacement property, and you've got another sale within 180 days. Possibly multiple if you know, split it up. So that's why you want to be familiar with them. And then with the contracts, you want to include the cooperation clauses in both of them. It has to be on the sale and the purchase of the properties. Again, those are GAR special steps, and then they're also available, like if you Google IRS 1031 contract steps, it's all statutory what has to be included in there. All right, helping to ensure a smooth exchange. You want to make sure your taxpayer has engaged a QI prior to closing. Like I said, I've had it done at the table before, but it's not smooth, so. Make sure 1031 documents and closing instructions are prepared prior to closing. Aid the taxpayer in actively searching for the replacement property as soon as possible. Remember the restrictions, the 45 days to identify, 180 days to exchange. Yeah, benefits to working with exchanges, opportunities to assist with multiple transactions that must close within a short time frame of time. So you've got like that guaranteed second sale if you're working with one. And then she talks about a little bit of a wealth building strategy. So you can exchange a non-performing asset for a cash flowing property. Like my husband and I own vacant land. It's not producing anything. We can do a 1031 exchange and reinvest in an income producing property of the same amount and not be hit with that tax right now, which would be awesome. Leverage equity from one relinquished property to multiple properties to increase cash flow. You can leverage equity from smaller relinquished properties to upgrade to one larger income producing property. Continue exchanging and never selling outright. So you can do a 1031 exchange and then 5 years later do another 1031 exchange. 5 years later do another 1031 exchange. And if you do that, your heirs inherit the property on a stepped up basis upon your taxpayer's death. So I'm 43. Say I do this, you know, every 10 years or so, and I'm 8 properties down the line when I die. Whatever the value of the real estate that I hold at that time is the stepped up basis for my kids when they inherit it. So they, you know, say the property is worth 500,000 today and it's worth 4 million, you know, in 40 years from now. Their basis in that property is going to be 4 million, not my 500,000. So that's what the stepped up basis means as far as the from the perspective of your heirs, why this is beneficial. Sorry, it's an hour-long class that I was trying to do in 20 minutes.
Oh, yeah, you're good, you're flying time. I have another question.
Okay.
What if, sorry, I'm full of questions. What if you get to that 46th day and you have not identified a property, and or between the 46th day and the 180 days, you can't get to closing? What happens? So on the 45th day, if there's no property identified, the QI has already, they're committed to refunding the money and canceling the sale. So, okay. And so if it gets refunded, then you just face the tax burden for that and you get, it's a cash value.
On the 180-day thing, Jay asked a similar question. I'm gonna find out for you guys, because I don't know, like, say there's a natural disaster or,
Mhm.
you know, COVID or something like that, that makes you not be able to close. I'm sure there are ramifications. I just don't know what it is, but I will find out and get that back to you.
Okay.
And I'm gonna find out about the dead people.
So in my situation, it's more, I've got a client who owns 2 condos. One's sold, one's still not sold. And he wants to reinvest the proceeds for both into 1031 exchange. But on the first one, obviously, we're fine. On the second one, we're running out of time. And so I don't know if they are wrapped together or how that.
So that may be, and like I said, I've never closed one, but that may be one that is the reverse. So that allows for the purchase of the replacement property before your relinquished property ever even sells. So that may be a good candidate to talk to Rachel about that. I can get you her contact information.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Because, like I said, it's possible. I just personally have never closed one. Any other questions? Yeah, does that make sense? Like why you want to just have this on your radar in case you're working with vacant land, vacant homes, anything like that? Like, hey, what are you guys doing with the money? Let me help you buy a replacement property and avoid all these taxes. That's it. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
That's it. You flew through that, girl.
I'm sorry.
Awesome. Will you open that door and see if Laura's here? Sorry. No, you're good.
No, but the food is, it's just not set up yet.
Oh, then Laura's here. She's here because she's the one that brought it. Laura?
She is, I'm sorry. she's-
Yeah.
It's getting set right now.
Tell her to come in. Laura, tell her to come in.
Oh,
It's her turn.
okay, 1 second.
In the meantime, any other questions? While Tiff is still here, got her undivided attention. Anything unrelated to this you want to ask Tiffany while we have her undivided attention?
Where'd you get your boot?
So cute.
Thank you. They're Vince Camuto. They're like my favorite brand. They're so comfortable.
Ta-da! There she is.
You're ready?
Tiffany.
Oh, y'all.